Beyond the maps colored by empires and the flags planted on distant shores lies a deeper and more unsettling truth about history. Empires do not fall simply because they grow old or weak. They fall because human beings, generation after generation, reach a point where survival without dignity is no longer enough. Long before treaties are signed or borders erased, resistance begins quietly, in villages, in whispered conversations, in the silent refusal to accept a life chosen by someone else. Imagine a world where power is enforced from thousands of miles away, where laws are written in a language you do not speak, where your labor enriches an empire you will never see. Every sunrise brings work demanded by others. Every sunset brings exhaustion without hope. This was not an abstract idea. For millions of people across Africa, it was daily reality. This is not simply a story about war or politics, it is a story about endurance. About how ordinary people pushed to the edge of survival can slowly reshape the world. And in southeastern Africa, that endurance would help bring one of the oldest empires in human history to its end. Portugal's empire began in the 15th century and stretched across oceans and continents. It was the first global empire and, for centuries, one of the most persistent. While other European powers rose and fell, Portugal remained. By the 20th century, even as much of the colonial world was collapsing, Portugal refused to let go. It insisted its empire was not an empire at all, but a single nation scattered across the globe. Mozambique stood at the center of that belief. Claimed as an overseas province, it was presented to the world as an inseparable part of Portugal. But for the people living there, the truth was far different. Portuguese rule controlled land, labor, and movement. Forced labor systems compelled men and women to work on plantations, in mines, and on colonial infrastructure projects. Taxes were imposed on families with little cash economy, forcing many into labor simply to survive. Education was limited and deliberately unequal. Political participation was non-existent. Most Mozambicans had no legal way to challenge the system that governed their lives. Wealth flowed outward toward Lisbon while poverty remained entrenched at home. Over generations, resentment grew quietly, passed from parent to child, village to village. After World War II, the world entered a new era. The idea that empires were natural or permanent began to crumble. Across Africa and Asia, independence movements gained strength. Former colonies demanded sovereignty, dignity, and control over their future. Portugal, however, stood firm. Its authoritarian government rejected decolonization entirely, convinced that surrendering African territories would mean the collapse of the nation itself. Mozambican students and workers living abroad absorbed the ideas of liberation spreading across the world. They saw independence achieved elsewhere and returned home with a dangerous thought. Portugal could be challenged. Meetings were held in secret. Ideas were exchanged cautiously. What began as political discussion gradually turned into organized resistance. The struggle began in 1964, when Frelimo launched its first attacks in northern Mozambique, striking Portuguese military posts and communication lines. In Lisbon, officials expected a brief rebellion. Portugal had a modern army, air power, and decades of colonial experience. The insurgents, by comparison, were lightly armed and largely rural. But the war did not unfold as Portugal expected. Frelimo avoided conventional battles and relied on guerrilla tactics. Fighters moved through forests and across borders, blending into villages, striking quickly and disappearing before retaliation could arrive. Portuguese forces often reached empty camps and silent terrain. The true strength of the rebellion lay not in weapons but in people. Villagers provided food, shelter, intelligence, and recruits. As Portuguese authority weakened in rural areas, Frelimo established liberated zones where colonial control vanished. Schools opened, basic healthcare emerged, and local administration replaced distant rule. For many Mozambicans, this was their first experience of self-governance. Portugal responded with escalating force. Troop numbers increased, villages suspected of aiding rebels were relocated, and airstrikes intensified. The strategy aimed to isolate the insurgents from the population, but it often backfired. Forced relocations disrupted daily life and deepened hostility, turning repression into recruitment. Mozambique was only one battlefield. Portugal was also fighting wars in Angola and Guinea-Bissau. 3 colonial conflicts drained the economy and exhausted the military. One of Western Europe's poorest nations was struggling to hold an empire far beyond its capacity. Young Portuguese men were conscripted into long deployments overseas. Many returned disillusioned or traumatized. Families questioned why their sons were dying for territories most of the world already considered lost. Quiet doubt spread within the military itself. International pressure intensified. The United Nations condemned Portugal's colonial policy, while newly independent African states supported liberation movements. Frelimo received training, weapons, and diplomatic backing from Cold War powers, further isolating Portugal on the global stage. By the early 1970s, the war showed no sign of ending. Portugal could neither defeat the insurgency nor withdraw without admitting failure. The conflict became a slow bleed, economically, militarily, and psychologically. What once symbolized national pride had become a burden threatening the nation's future. Inside Portugal, a breaking point approached. Younger military officers, many hardened by service in Africa, began questioning both the war and the dictatorship sustaining it. They no longer saw the empire as strength, but as a trap pulling the country downward. In April 1974, they acted. A military coup unfolded in Lisbon with almost no bloodshed. Civilians filled the streets, placing carnations into soldiers' rifles. The Carnation Revolution ended decades of authoritarian rule in a single day. The new government moved swiftly. Colonial wars were ended, negotiations opened, and Portugal accepted what history had already decided. In 1975, Mozambique became independent, ending nearly 5 centuries of Portuguese rule. Frelimo assumed power, and hundreds of thousands of Portuguese settlers departed, leaving behind a nation suddenly responsible for its own future. Independence brought hardship, instability, and later conflict, but it also brought sovereignty. Control over land, language, and destiny returned to Mozambicans themselves. Mozambique's revolution did more than free a single country. It helped dismantle one of the longest-lasting empires in human history. What began in remote villages reshaped Portugal and accelerated the collapse of its African empire. Empires rarely fall in a single moment. They erode through resistance, exhaustion, and change. Mozambique proved that even the oldest empires cannot survive when people refuse to remain silent. Portugal's empire ended not with a final battle, but with the realization that domination was no longer possible. And in that moment, Mozambique secured its place in the long history of how empires fall and how human endurance reshapes the world.